If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Romans chapter 1. This is where we're going to spend our time. This sermon was really, I guess, in crafting it, I went to a conference this week. I call it a conference, I don't know what you call it. Anyway, it's one of the Piedmont meetings. And it was an evangelism workshop. Now, that's fine, and I appreciate the fact that the Piedmont puts these things on, and there's always something to be gained from them. But it caused me to really reflect upon the fact of the way in which this world is right now. And the way it is it's mostly lost. Most of the world is lost. Most of the people in this country are lost. Most of the people, I would say most of the people in Ware County are lost. That's just how it is. Jesus said, the way of eternal life is narrow and few find it. The way of destruction is broad and many go that way. So here Paul, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, which I firmly believe, personally, he diagnoses the outcome of the fallen condition as it progresses in humanity. A world in which there's enough light for anybody who doesn't know the Lord to find the Lord. There's enough light, no matter who we are, no matter how lost, there's enough light that anybody who, if they want to, can find the Lord. But if we don't, then there are all kinds of entailments for the human machine. And Paul is giving us a list of those entailments. So let's look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and the unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness. Because what can be known about God is plain to all of them, because God has made it plain. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, because they are understood through what has been made, so no one has an excuse. For although they knew God, they didn't glorify him as God, nor give him thanks, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for an image resembling mortal human beings, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in their desires to impurity, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creation rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them over to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged the natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. And likewise the men also abandoned natural relations with women, and were inflamed in their passions for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do that which should not be done. Now, what's the picture here? The picture here is a world in utter chaos, and the people participating in the chaos love the chaos. That's what it is. They love it. They want it. Why is that? Well, Paul is giving us an explanation. Now, this is important to keep in mind as you read this text, any text in the Bible. This can never say to us what it didn't say to the writer. Ever. If you read a text in the Bible, people will appropriate texts many times to themselves for reasonable reasons, because they like it. But it's important to remember, no text can say to us what it didn't say to the writer. Just can't be. And if we find that's the case, then we've misread it. So Paul is telling us that in his day and in our day, it is not pure ignorance that God is not known. It's not. He's telling us that there's a suppression of that which can be known. That we can know God. Anybody can. But we're suppressing it. And it's interesting the way he puts it. we're suppressing it by the suppression of the knowledge. In other words, it's a feedback loop. The more we misbehave as human beings, the more the knowledge is suppressed, until finally that suppression and misbehavior becomes so interlinked that they just feed upon one another, and the whole thing goes further down the hill. Jesus said, when he looked out on a crowd, he said they're like sheep without a shepherd. Remember that? Now, this is even bigger. These people, us, human beings, are rejecting the shepherd that's there. More than just sheep without a shepherd, it's people who don't want a shepherd at all. So the misbehavior it begets more misbehavior, which begets more suppression, which puts us in the place where we find ourselves so utterly given over to our own thinking that we can't think any other way. Without the maker of the universe penetrating that shell, the Spirit of God doing that, they will not be penetrated. Just won't happen. There's a sense here. I love words. I love words. Anybody that knows me very well knows that I enjoy words. I had a friend of mine in Pennsylvania who wrote a book of essays. He was a music store owner, and he had a book. It was a huge thing. It was about this thick. It was like a whole earth catalog thick thing, where he just wrote all these essays that were personally interesting to him, and he wrote one about me. He said, I've got this friend who loves words so much, and he thinks there are some words that are just really funny, like jumbo. I think jumbo is a funny word. Or fuzz. Fuzz is a funny word to me. Well, there's a word that we use all the time, and in context with this text, it's called responsibility. We hear all the time about responsibility. Think what the word means when you parse it. What does it mean? We think of it as, oh, I have an accountability structure that I'm beholden to somehow. That's part of the meaning, but the word itself really means I have the ability to respond. That's what it means. So Paul is saying everybody on the planet has the ability to respond to God properly, but it's being suppressed. What Paul is saying here is what Solomon said many centuries before Paul. Eternity has been planted in the human heart. Everybody on the planet who has lived, is living, or ever will live knows that God is there. Deep down, they know. They do. Why do you think people are so violent in their resistance to it, to the idea? It's not because they don't know, it's because they don't want to know. Right? It's willful. So, look at history. Anthropology alone tells us this is true. There's a dig that was recent in the last 5 years in Anatolia, Turkey. They dug up a temple. Big thing, huge thing. It was a temple to a monotheistic deity, 30,000 years old. People have always known that there is a maker. There is some person whom we can't directly experience physically who has made all of this. Everybody knows it. Francis Crick. You may not know who Francis Crick is. Very famous person if you have any background in biology. Francis Crick and James Watson discovered the DNA double helix molecule. They discovered it. 3.5 billion bit pairs of information, very specific to KG or to Lucy. That's a lot of information. It's the biggest book there is, 3.5 billion words. Francis Crick, who was an atheist, as was James Watson, said this. Now think about this and think about what Paul has said here. He said in writing, we enter our labs each day studying mechanisms that look to be designed, and then we have to remind ourselves they are not. Now that's just crazy. I don't care how smart, and he was a smart guy, but that's crazy, simply crazy. This is what Paul is speaking about directly. There's a suppression of that which is obvious to any human being. I would encourage everybody here that if anybody ever confronts you with an idea that completely defies your common sense human experience, you should be very suspicious of it. Very suspicious of it. The evidence that human beings need to worship something is seen throughout time. That tells me that every human being has always known that God is there. Paul uses a very specific word here. If you read Greek, you see that Paul's Greek is very precise. He uses a word here that describes the human condition in the fact of this suppression. Emorantheson. Emorantheson. You know what that word means? Moron. They became morons. They were smart enough to know God's there, but they became emorantheson, morons. So this is what is creating the rebellion. You see, when we talk to people who don't believe, the worst thing we can do is cut across the idea that they're smart enough or not smart enough to know whether or not they should believe. That's a mistake we often make. But sometimes it's almost unavoidable because God himself says they became morons. Wow. And so what does God do? He does what he's always done. He, as the ultimate libertine in the cosmos. God is the ultimate libertine. He gave the first two humans everything. Here's the whole world. It's all yours. You be. That's what you need to do, is just be. But don't eat of that one. That was the only rule they had. And so what does he do? He steps aside and allows them to make their choice. He does that for every human being on the planet. So what happens? Once we make the bad decision, he steps aside yet again and says, if that's the way you want it, you just go ahead. And then what happens? Well, we express our new freedom totally fully. And in expressing that freedom, we become slaves to that which we think is our place of freedom. We become total slaves to it. And what happens then? Well, you see it. Paul describes it here. We become damaged in our human machine to the degree that we can no longer assess the truth at all, even if we're confronted with it. Aristotle said something very interesting, and I think these Greek philosophers, most of them were pagans. I think Aristotle was probably a pagan. Don't know. If he's there in heaven, I'll ask him about it when I see him. But if he was, makes no difference. He was onto something. You know, the Bible talks about the sower throwing out the seeds of truth. The sower's been throwing that out since there have been human beings. And some of them caught it. Aristotle caught it. He said this. He said, the natural condition of the human person is virtuous. In other words, it's natural. The place where the human being is supposed to be, the way the machine is supposed to work, is virtue. He's right. How do I know that? Because I look back to the garden. And that is God's original intent for us, is that all we had to do was just be. And we were, by being, reflecting God back to himself. Of course, that's not the condition now, is it? At all. Aristotle was onto something here. The natural condition is virtue, but we're not virtuous. What does that mean? That means something's wrong with the machine. You and me. So a lot of people look at this passage and they think it's cruel. It's out of date. It's Paul's harsh. He's telling us things that we really don't care about. What about the God who's love? He's love. You know, he's all love, right? I don't argue with that at all. I think he is all love. I do. But what does it mean to love is the question. That's not the question that ever gets asked. God is angry, right? Wrath. What is wrath? It's anger. Expressed anger. God says in this text that his anger, his wrath is expressed upon us, we who rebel. What does that mean? What is God's anger? In this text, if you read it and think about it for very long, you'll see that it's expressed in a very specific way. God's anger is expressed in perfection. You see, the problem with this is, what most people, when they read this and they think Paul harsh, is they're looking at anger from the point of view that we have as anger. If I'm angry, right? If you're angry with somebody, we're expressing that anger. That is not God's anger. Not God's anger at all. Even when the best we can ever come to as a parent, when we become angry with our children, and that anger is used in a way of discipline with children, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's different from God's anger. It is different from God's anger. God directs his anger. Think about it from his perspective for just a moment. First of all, we rebel. God steps back and gives us what we want. And the giving us what we want creates even more damage than was there to start with. And it just gets worse. You have to remember, in all this, and if you read the rest of the text, it grows more terrible as you read it. In this text, you have to remember that Paul is describing the conditions in which he was. We read it and we think, ooh, things are so bad today. They're nothing compared to what Paul saw. Nothing. I mean, we're debating right now. We're in the cusp of it. I believe that. The fact of this whole gender debate right now is putting us on the cusp of this. I heard a woman, an educated, otherwise sober, thinking woman, say, yes, a man can have a baby. Now, I don't know where she was in her mind at that point. Perhaps she had ingested some chemical that had completely destroyed her ability to reason. But I think I know what she meant. God has built into every human being the moral law. We all know it. Nobody would say to you or to me, it's a good thing to torture puppies for fun. Nobody. Everybody would feel a sense of pain in their heart if they saw someone torture a puppy. Why do you think that in these conflicts we're seeing that both sides will bring children out who are injured and put them on film so that everybody can see how bad the other side is in this conflict? It's because the moral law is imprinted on every human heart, period. Everybody knows it. So when we take the moral law and disobey it, God then visits his wrath upon us. And his wrath is visited to a greater and greater and greater degree. The worst thing that can happen is God lifts his wrath off and leaves us completely alone. You see, God's anger is not like our anger. God's anger is mercy being expressed. What is God's goal? Peter says it. He wishes that none be lost, that everybody is saved. Okay, why is he expressing anger here? It's not just because he's mad like we are. It's because he's saying to these people, I'm going to do whatever I can to get you back. I'm going to bring my anger to you so that you will come back. That's mercy. That's not anger like we think of it. This whole text here hinges on one theological premise, and that is what's known as natural theology. You may never have heard that term. There are all kinds of theologies. You may not be aware of that. There's biblical theology, there's historical theology, there's systematic theology, and there's natural theology. Natural theology is, I look out there and I pick up a leaf and I look at the intricate mechanism in this leaf and I say to myself, wow, somebody had to do this. In other words, just what Paul says, the very nature of God is expressed in the nature that he has created. And a lot of people recognize that. Francis Crick recognized it. Yeah, it looks designed, but I have to remind myself it's not. In other words, there's such intricacy here, I have to admit that it looks like it was thought out. But I have to remind myself it wasn't. That's suppression. I think it's crazy, but that's suppression. But you know, Francis Crick and every scientist on this planet right now, do you know they rest in one theological truth that they don't realize they rest in? Do you know how science got started in the 16th and 17th centuries? One reason. The universe seems to be intelligible to me. I look out and I understand things about it, and I can learn things about it. That told them the reason they thought the universe to be intelligible, and all the universe, was because they believed that there was a rational creator behind it who thought things out. And we're able somehow to tease out what the creator thought. James Clerk Maxwell, think about this. Now this to me My head, I wish I had this intellect. I really do. James Clerk Maxwell, 19th century physicist. I'm going to tell you what he discovered, and then I'll let you think about how bizarre this is that he made this connection. He discovered the relationship that said to him that light was part of the electromagnetic spectrum at a certain frequency. Now think about that. 19th century, this isn't like last week. That's the kind of thing I'd be impressed with if somebody had discovered it last week with all the technology we have. He did this in the 19th century. He reasoned, and he's right. You can go to England right now, and you can see Clerk Maxwell's statue, and his equation is on a plaque. We still use the equation today. That explains the fact that light, which you can't see, you don't see light. You just see what it falls on, its effect. I can't see anything between that bulb and the carpet. But it's the fact that our eyes take it in is because it's part of an electromagnetic spectrum that includes radio, gamma, X-rays, and everything else. He reasoned that. That's amazing to me. And you know what he had as a plaque over his laboratory? I'm working to uncover the works of God. How about that? Science assumes that. That's how come modern science works, because we're assuming there's something intelligible that we can study. Why should there be? If it's all just random, it shouldn't be anything worth studying at all. We shouldn't make any sense of it. It all should just be a jumble, like somebody who's had mushrooms and looks at a kaleidoscope. It's just a bunch of colors and shapes. Doesn't mean anything. But it is intelligible. In theology, in theological philosophical reflection, there's a term called necessary. You may not know. For you, necessary means it's necessary that I wash my clothes occasionally. But this is a different kind of necessity. This necessity means that this thing that is necessary cannot not be. Cannot not be. God is the only thing in the universe that has necessary existence. He simply is. Isn't it amazing? Have you ever thought about it, why he came to Moses, and Moses says, hey, God, appreciate all this neat stuff you're commissioning me to do. But, when I go back to the Israelites, they're going to ask me what your name is. What's your name? And God says, I am. That's good enough for you, Moses. Think about what that means. That it encompasses the idea that God simply is. He's the only necessary thing in reality. And everything else is what is called contingent. If anybody ever gets into an argument with you, remind them there are only two kinds of existence. Period. Necessary and contingent. What are we? We're contingent. All that means is we depend upon something else for our existence. And the whole universe seems to be the same. So, fallen humanity, people out there, we wonder how come they don't. Man, you give them the gospel and they hear it and they just seem to not be affected by it at all. Why is that? Because underlying all of it, they just believe that the universe is nothing but a material object. I'm a material object. You're a material object. I remember reading Bertrand Russell's book, Why I Am Not a Christian. Have you ever read that? Has anybody in here ever read that? Oh, the most cogent statement of unbelief in print. And in it, he says, I look at the universe, I don't see a creator at all. He says, as a matter of fact, I look around and I see all kinds of flaws. There are volcanoes and they kill people. There are floods. There are tsunamis. There are diseases. There are mosquitoes. Somebody mentioned mosquitoes a little while ago. They kill people. What's going on? If this creation's so great, I could improve upon it. I'm just a human being. I can think of all kinds of ways to make it better. What's the assumption? The assumption is there's no God at all behind any of it. That's the assumption. What's wrong with the assumption? It never asks the questions that are proper. Maybe the things out there look to be the way they are because they're not as they intended to be. If there's a God, the fact that someone can be pierced in their skin by a mosquito's proboscis and be injected with malaria was never God's intention. Never. That question doesn't get asked. So what is it that's going on? It's the suppression. It's the suppression of the truth that if a person would just let go of their human hubris for just a moment, and at least ask the question, I wonder, maybe things aren't the way they ought to be, and I see that, as Bertrand Russell did, but maybe they're not the way they ought to be because they're no longer the way they were intended to be. That makes good sense to me. So, some questions we might ask. Does the universe mean anything at all, or is it just a random thing? Were the Romans right? I was not. This was the saying among the Roman centurions, among the Roman intelligentsia. I was not, but now I am, and I will not be. Is that correct? Or is there an intent for this universe and you and me in it? Could it be? There's a question that I would ask. Could it be that the best place for human flourishing, if there is a God, is to be close to Him? That's a reasonable question. Could it be that without the worship of God, we're going to worship lesser things and suppress the knowledge that God might be trying to give us? That seems like a reasonable question to me. Could it be that I'm just not seeing things like I ought to? Could it be the problem is me? Could Bertrand Russell have just, before he wrote that book, thought, gee, maybe I'm really not seeing things the way they really are? Could that be? Sure it could. Think about it like this with me for a moment. Put on your logic hat and let's think about God this way. If God exists, let's be very generous and say, if God exists, what would entail? Well, this is back to my love of words. If you take the two words supreme and being, now I know that's left to right for you. Okay, let me do it for you. Supreme and being. And you place those two words together, it means something, right? Everything we know about being is then going to be supreme. Well, then what do we know about being? We know that being has personality. We know that being has the accessibility to virtue. We know that being has the accessibility to life. So if it's supreme in every way, and there can only be one supreme. This is where people say, well, maybe there are a bunch of gods. No, I mean, there could be that, but we're not talking about the supreme being. We're talking about beings. Here's what would follow. Think with me for a moment. If there is a supreme being, he would be, I'll even go more generous, it would be the maker of everything. It would have necessary existence, and everything apart from it would be contingently existing, that is, dependent upon something else for its existence. If it exists, then it seems to me, since I'm intelligent, it would be intelligent, therefore it's a person, not a it. And that means I'm dependent upon it in some way for life. If I'm dependent upon it, then I'm accountable to it, to Him, right? 3, if we're going to know what this being expects, how will we know it? He's got to tell us. There's no way we would know otherwise, right? 4, if we're rational, then it's because we reflect the rationality of this being, since He made us, right? We're able to think, we're able to know, the being is able to think and know. And 5, and if our rationality were able to choose to accept the knowledge of Him, then that means we can also reject it, right? The human being can choose to go wrong. And if we reject it, lastly, does it not follow that we will lack something fundamental to our flourishment if our flourishment is to be near this being? Doesn't that make sense? Makes sense to me. So I just say to you all, when you look around at this world, if you encounter people who you know in your family who don't know the Lord, thank God that He has supplied a remedy for all of this. A remedy that anybody can reach out and access. Draw near to God, He'll draw near to you, according to the very word that He's given us. And that remedy is the cross of Jesus. That if we're just willing to bend that knee, God will honor that bent knee every time and remedy all of this suppression of the truth that is so endemic to the human condition, such that the human machine doesn't even work the way it's supposed to any longer without him. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything at all about which you have a question, you want to pray with me, speak with me, I'll stay as long as it takes as we close.